Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the AASLH virtual classroom. I'm Terry Jackson, a program associate here at AASLH, which is located in Nashville, Tennessee. To begin today's event, I would like to thank Learning Times for assisting AASLH in setting up this online learning environment so that we can share information with you. Learning Times has provided AASLH with the classroom and training and a lot of technical assistance that we need for this event. In addition, we have Susan Manning in the background, who you previously heard, monitoring the event in case we need further technical assistance. We greatly appreciate all they do for AASLH. The AASLH mission statement and the website address is on the screen. We do appreciate all our members, and if you're not a member and would like to see more educational opportunities like this one, you to complete a quick poll as soon as I get it resized. And if you could tell us whether you're an AASLH member or not. Here it goes. At all our events, we'd like to know how many AASLH members and non-members are attending. I'll give you just a few seconds to complete that. And it looks like we're about done, so I'm going to close it. There are a few tips and reminders that we need to tell you about before we get started with the webinar. You have already been doing that. And you can enter your comments and questions and click on the rectangle box and type in your questions. When you hit enter, it does post it. We've had a couple of questions this morning about the name showing up as parentheses. If you did not enter your first and last name when you logged into the virtual office, that's why your name will not show up in this spot. Please feel free to talk among yourself and ask questions during the presentation. There will be several people in the background, myself included, monitoring the chat box so that we can make sure that all your questions will be answered. If you hear an echo in your speakers or headset, check to see that you don't have more than one window open. And if this is happening, section on the screen where it says make sure your computer is not muted. I know you guys, if you're hearing this, your speakers are not muted. Hopefully this will help them. And if all else fails, close the application, reboot, and log back on. Word has been planned and sponsored by the AASLH Small Museums Committee. These people are a very dynamic part of the AASLH community. Each person on this committee is a volunteer, and they have worked long and tirelessly to create a new online community for small museums. And this webinar is just part of the result is of hard work that they do for us. I would especially like to thank Kathy Lang of the Jean Lafitte National Historic Park and Preserve. She has coordinated all the speakers for today's presentation. And with that, I would like to introduce you to your next speaker, Stacy Klingler. She's the Assistant Director of Local History Service with the Indiana Historical Society.
Today, there's 88 folks on our attendee list. Unfortunately, I do have to let you know that one of our presenters is not able to join us, and so we'll be kind of doing a little pinch hitting and a more question and answer period with the help of Kathy Lang and Ann Ackerson. I'd like to start out just to find out a little bit more about all of you. I do understand that there are some audio issues that we're trying to deal with in the background, and so we've got folks working on that. But while we're waiting, let me find out a little bit about you all. If you could tell us if you are watching this by yourself or with other folks, if you're doing this kind of as a joint project, that kind of lets us know how you're using the webinar services or these events that we're hosting. It looks like a lot of you are by yourself, which we don't find unsurprising in the small museum community, since sometimes you're the only person working there. So thank you all so much for participating in that poll. I'm going to leave that up down here at the bottom for just a minute and bring out my second poll question, which is, how did you find out about this webinar? Those other sites where you found out about us, if you want to put those in the chat, we'd love to hear about that. It's good to see that lots of you are on the Small Museum listserv. We also hope that you might be on the Small Museum community. If you haven't heard of that, that is a new effort from the Small Museums Committee. So I'm going to throw this out here and say, if you can let us know if you are a member of the Small Museums online community. You should see that poll appearing now. Here we go. From connecting to collections, that's great. We know that the topic of deaccession has been one that's been asked for in the Connecting to Collections online community, which is one of the reasons that we decided to try to address some of those issues here. I will let you know that we know that deaccessioning is a huge topic, and you're having these conversations with your colleagues, at national conferences, and we just think this is going to be the beginning of the conversation that we'll be having in the Small Museum online community. We will most likely host events like this in the future. We know that deaccessioning is perhaps the choice that comes up at board meetings when folks don't know exactly what's involved with deaccessioning. When you run out of space, it seems like you might as well get something out of the way and make room for more new stuff. But of course, the more you work in museums, the more you know that that is just not the best option always. But we also do know that because of technical difficulties, there appear to be no phones at Harper Ferries that work right now. So she's not able to join us. So we're going to start our presentation with Ann Ackerson. She's the director of the Museum Association of New York. Before that, she was the director of several historic house museums and historical societies in New York State, including the Rensselaer County Historical Society in Troy and the historic Cherry Hill in Albany. Ann now works with many to help museums and heritage organizations have the best possible, effective, and ethical board, staff, and volunteer leadership they can. And so her portion of our workshop today will be about the ethical and legal issues around it. Hope that you all can enjoy that. So, Ann, would you like to take the lead?
Sure, Stacy. Thanks so much for that introduction. And hello, everybody. I'm just really delighted to see so many participants on this webinar today. Of course, I know it is a topic of interest to a lot of folks in the field, and it's surprisingly a topic of interest to people in the public as well. The reason that I think the reason that I was asked to be part of this webinar today is because of some recent experiences that we've had at the Museum Association of New York within the last 6 or 7 years or so, in terms of developing criteria for deaccessioning. I'm going to share a little of that with you, and I'm happy to answer questions that you might have about that. But I really want to start with a more sort of general overview of what I consider legal and ethical considerations to deaccessioning, and then we can go from there. So I want to begin first with a quick definition review. And up here on the screen you see 4 primary definitions. Deaccession, which means the permanent removal of property from the collection of a museum, and it means nothing more than that. Disposal means the sale, exchange, donation, or transfer, or in fact the destroying of deaccession property by any means to any person. And though it's important to keep this distinction very clear, that deaccessioning is one action, disposal is a second action. There are 2. It's been my experience, and it's probably been some of yours as well, that the minute some people hear the word deaccession, they immediately think that the item is going to be taken to the marketplace and sold, and that is not the case. I've also included the term property here, which is the legal definition we use in New York State that means any inanimate object, document, organism, or tangible object under a museum's care which has intrinsic historic, artistic, scientific, or cultural value. So it's not the office desk chair, and it's not that set of broken Venetian blinds hanging precariously from the window in the curator's office. Those are a different kind of property altogether. And lastly, publicly operate and how we deal with the public, to know that our museums have been formed, incorporated to provide a benefit to the public. And it's something that we need to keep in mind throughout all of our activities, not just collection management, but the whole 9 yards of the work that we do is to meet this public trust goal. So, as Marie Malero states, it's not so much, the debate is not so much over terminology. We get the definitions, we know the glossary. It's over the practice of deaccessioning. Museums are collecting institutions, and there's an inherent tug-of-war between the collecting nature of museums and the appropriate controlled management of collections, with the reality being that not everything could or should be collected, and no museum has unlearned. Translate to others that there's this critical interdependence between judicious collecting on the one hand and judicious deaccessioning on the other. Malero goes on to note that what is collected and what is disposed of is usually left in the hands of individual institutions. There are no laws except for those in New York State relating to this, and there's no national policy that tells museums what they collect and how they collect, what they should deaccession, how they should deaccession. So as a result, our professional associations have developed codes of ethics that help to guide and standardize institutional practice and decision-making. However, as we'll see a little later on, some of these views differ on their implementation. So the bottom line here, from a legal and ethical standpoint, is you put items into its permanent collection. And when a museum accessions an object, it makes an intellectual judgment that the object was worthy of indefinite preservation. And I think that this speaks to the most basic function of collection management, the establishment of ownership when an item comes to the museum, and that it receives an accession number, which is its unique tracking number that will follow it for as long as that item is in the permanent collection of the institution. And I have to say, I really question a museum's professionalism if this most basic of activities is not understood, it's not practiced, and it's not maintained. Deaccessioning does not apply to items on loan or items that were never accessioned. And I recall seeing in the chat box, I think even before the webinar began, there was a question about the accepting of items that would in fact be used for fundraising purposes. But an agreement has been made with the donor that the gift has been made to the institution, and that item is going to be turned around and used for a fundraiser or some other activity. Could be items that are coming in to go into an education collection, but they're not ending up in the permanent collection. So these are items that are never accessioned. And then items in the permanent collection should, of course, have that documentation and of ownership by using a clear title, or excuse me, a deed of gift or a transfer record, whatever it might be called in your institution. And sometimes other forms of documentation might take that place, such as a correspondence where the donor is quite clear in making intentions known that that an item is to come into the permanent collection of the institution, and that there's some there's some in terms of ownership and transfer of ownership to an institution. So we have a poll question here for you. It's poll number 7. Just wanting to check to see if your institution is currently using a deed of gift and accepting material for your collection. And the numbers are looking really good. Most of you, the vast majority of your institution is institutions have a deed of gift or some form like that is used at the time the museum is accepting materials into the permanent collection. It transfers ownership of that item from the donor to the institution. That's what a deed of gift does. And it's very important for an institution to have a clear record that it is the owner of the item and that that ownership has been transferred from the donor to the institution. Otherwise, you don't own it. Deed of gift, I strongly suggest that you put a deed of gift into practice right away. And if you need help with that, of course, AASLH is standing by to help. And perhaps you have a field service organization or a regional museum service agency, or maybe there's a great museum in your community or nearby, and you can get some help that way too. Okay, thank you very much for deed of gift. Let's go to the second poll question, which is 8. If you could share with us what percentage of your collection has deeds of gift. How are we doing? And Stacy, if you're on the line and have anything to add or ask, please feel free to. Deeds of gift for a little less than a third now, for 76 to 100% of their collection. Actually, it's pretty evenly divided there. And I would say that that's, in the whole scheme of things, not uncommon. Deeds of gift, I think, probably were not used with any regularity early on in some museums' histories. And so, obviously, there are going to be things that I would say probably pretty much every museum has a certain amount of material that they simply don't have a deed of gift for. Okay, thank you. So that brings us to, the deed of gift question brings us to this issue of not having title of ownership for items in your collection. And as I said a moment ago, there's probably no museum in the country that has a deed of gift for everything, for every item in their possession. These are often called found in collection items. I've also heard them referred to as curator's nightmares. These are items that simply have no documentation, no written documentation. Their ownership is uncertain, but yet they're in the possession of your institution. Are these undocumented objects museum property, or could they belong to somebody else? Might they be loans? Some might contain accession numbers, but no deed. Frankly, without that legal title, removing an item from the museum is a risky venture. And I'll go back to Marie Malaro because she's really kind of the wellspring of information about deaccessioning. In her seminal book on museum law, which is called The Legal Primer on Managing Museum Collections, it's been around for a long time, but it's well worth adding to your bookshelf if you don't have it. She writes that the continued undisturbed possession of undocumented objects by the museum usually supports a presumption of a valid transfer of ownership, with the burden of proof falling on the party disputing this presumption. So, in many cases, I suppose you could say that possession can be 9/10 of the law. The institution has had an item, has had it for a long period of time, has had it in there, and so the burden of proof in this case is on the claimant. But wouldn't it be nice if the institution had a piece of paper, some documentation that proved that it was the rightful owner. Malero goes on to add that in some cases, if a museum disposes of that item, removes it from their collection, and sells it or transfers it, and a claimant comes along at a later date, the museum could be held liable for removing that item from its premise, damage that that item might sustain, or if the claimant can't get it back from the new owner, the museum might be part of a lawsuit that way. So, ability that is sometimes simply beyond an organization's ability to manage that responsibility. And I think that if your institution is really drowning in property that you have been unable to actively manage with appropriate collection management policies and documents and so forth, I think you really need to do some soul searching about whether having a collection is really achieving the mission of your institution, or if it in fact has become a drain on your resources. I think that perhaps there are some organizations that probably should. So what can you do if you have? And there is no federal law, Laura. I just saw your question there in the chat box. There aren't any federal laws, at least not governing private nonprofit museums. Perhaps this is true for government museums. I know in the case of well, this is a state case. I mean, state museums tend to have laws directly aimed at them, but for the vast majority of museums and heritage organizations in the country, there aren't any laws around this. New York State is an exception, however. We do have by our state education department, and that department has regulations that have the force of law that really sort of determine how museums operate and how they deaccession. So you've got collections that have no title. You may have had them for 10 days, 10 years, 10 decades. They have been in your possession, and you are wanting to make an effort to get clear title to those items. Because until you do get clear title, all you can do is hang on to. I mean, technically, all you can do is hang on to them, and you can't claim them as your own property. So proving clear title is really important, and how can you do that? Well, see if you have museum-specific abandoned property laws, or they're also called old loan laws. And what these laws do is provide a legal framework for an institution to be able to eventually claim title to property that they have in their possession but they don't own. And in the case of New York State's law, which was just made into law in 2009, what the setup is the museum has to provide public notice in newspapers, those legal ads in days, and then you place the ad again, and then you wait a similar length of time, and at the end of those two waiting periods, if no claimant has come forward saying, I'm the rightful owner of this material and I'm taking it back, or I'm going to give it to you, the museum automatically claims title. And I think that may be the way it works in many other states, but these laws vary from state to state, so it's worth number one, finding out if your state has a museum-specific abandoned property law.
Anne, can I weigh in here just
yes,
a little
please.
bit? This is Stacy. I work in Indiana, and we also have a museum-specific abandoned property law that we use, very similar about providing notice and holding an object for a certain amount of time. For us, there's a special terminology for it, but it's an optional law. It's not something that every museum has to go out and prove that they own or gain title to everything in their collection. It's just a process you can go through to to essentially establish your ownership, which is what you need to do before. They look at the value, the monetary value of an object in weighing the risk, and they look at the community value of the object. And if either of those is high, if somebody's gold watch, or if it's the 7th copy of the original mayor's tuxedo, I don't know, whatever that may be, if it's something that they're concerned about the community being upset about, that they've would consider keeping or not keeping, then when those things are high, that's when they use the law. But when they've got the broken teapot that they found in the collection with no lid to it, they don't necessarily go through the process, the time, and the expense of establishing ownership before taking it out of the collection.
Well, I think you raise a good point, Stacy. And this is especially true for history museums, I think, where many items in collections don't have a high. I think history museums do go through that kind of triage. I'm certainly not foolish enough to think that every museum is going to place everything in or pursue title to everything that's in their possession. But they will make some sort of value determination, if you will, as to which items you really want to follow through with the law, and so that you can then make a clear decision that you're accessioning this into your permanent collection or you're going to dispose of it. I think failing in a museum-specific abandoned property law in your state, if your state doesn't have one, the next best course of action would be to look to see what sort of general abandoned property law your state might have. This would be abandoned property for anything. But again, it provides a legal recourse, a set of actions that you could use. And I would think that following the procedures of another state's law would be very helpful, because essentially what you're trying to do is create a paper trail that you made every full faith effort to locate the owner and or the heirs or the assigns, and just clear title. So I've given you the section in New York law, education law, for our abandoned property, with the link there so that you can see it. And we'll move on to talking about justifying those deaccessioning decisions. I think it's really important to remember that deaccessioning is a process. It's a layers of people in your institution, and it really rests with having a collection management policy that is in place. Not only in place, it's in use. And that collection management policy covers all aspects of procedure relating to collection holding and management of those collections while in the institution, as well as deaccessioning. And many collection management policies also will include a scope of collections, which I define as a discussion as to what items would be collected by the institution, which would support the mission of the institution. Secondly,
I'm sorry, Anne, would you be interested in looking at how many folks have policies or scopes of collection?
Oh, thank you.
Right
sure.
Now? We have that poll question there for the entire history of the organization.
Right. Well, and that's the other thing, sort of the undercurrent in all of this discussion, is that I think probably many of us come from institutions that have very long histories, and at least for the early part of the history of the institution, there was probably very little documentation of collections. Curators, registrars, and other people, collections managers, are faced with dealing with collections that the institution has possessed for a very long time, that don't have sufficient records. And that backlog exists for many, many institutions. So I'm delighted to see that so many of you do have a collection management policy in place, and hopefully you're using it on a regular basis. And that's supported by a code of ethics for your institution, which should be in place and in use all the time. And then what we're after here really is consistent decision making. The type of decision making that a prudent person would make again and again when faced with the same or similar circumstances. That consistency is the basis of ethical practice. So this framework helps to ensure that deaccession decision making is approached with uniformity each time, thus reducing precedent-setting, one-time only decisions or special exceptions, or as we say in New York State, desperation deaccessioning. And I can give you, well, let me go on and talk for a sec here about criteria for deaccessioning. And we do have another poll, number 9, so why don't we bring that up, and let me ask it now. Let us know how many of you have criteria by which you make your deaccessioning decisions. Percent of you do. So remember, I said deaccessioning is part of a process and part of to create consistent decision making. And so part of that consistency comes from having a set of standard criteria that you as curators, collection managers, registrars, heads of collections committees will use again and again and again to determine which items should or could be deaccessioned from the permanent collection. So this is to take away any sort of emotional connection or whim to the deaccession museums and heritage organizations here, and I'll go through those 10 with you. The first being that the object is inconsistent with the institution's mission. It has failed to retain its identity. It's lost some of its original identity, or is losing it rapidly. It is redundant. The item's preservation or conservation needs are beyond the capacity of the institution to provide for it any longer. The item is deaccessioned in order for the museum to refine collections. This is particularly true for art museums, which are constantly refining their collections. It has been deemed to be inauthentic. It is being returned to the donor or heirs or assigns to fulfill donor restrictions relating to the item, which the institution is no longer able to meet. An example of that would be that an institution accepts an item from a donor with a restriction that the item has to be on exhibit all the time. And after a while, the institution realizes that to leave the item on exhibit, it would be to really risk its identity, its character. It could be detrimental over the long term, and so the institution realizes that it can't keep this item on exhibit all the time. Has a conversation with the donor, and the donor may wish to take it back. That would be a legitimate reason to deaccession it. And finally, the item has been lost or stolen and has not been recovered. And this certainly happens in collections over a long period of time. Sometimes items go missing, and Stacy,
are you?
You're asking that question? I see a question from Stacy.
I let that go for a little while. That's for a little later.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm looking in the wrong place. Desperation deaccessioning, yes. That came up several years ago by a reporter who in New York State who was really kind of challenging some of the issues that we were having here in this state. And we did have some outstanding issues back in the 2008 and 2009. First beginning with Fort Ticonderoga up in the North Country in New York State, which wanted to deaccession Thomas Paine, and I think also to take care of some general operations debt. And that really kind of kicked off the discussion in our state about deaccessioning, and was termed by this particular reporter as desperation deaccessioning at that time, and that name kind of stuck. What ultimately happened with the Fort Ticonderoga case is that they did not deaccession the Thomas Cole painting. Department that if they could find another home for the painting in New York State, they would be able to deaccession it. Well, you know, there aren't too many museums that can afford to buy a Thomas Cole painting, and the fort did approach the two large institutions in our state, neither of which wanted the painting. So that kind of did that. Another case later in that same year, 2008, was the National Academy in New York City, which deaccessioned two Hudson River School paintings to complete capital work on their building and to also cover some operating debt. And that was the source of a lot of headlines in the newspaper as well. And that picks up on something that we'll get into a little bit later, and that's the whole notion of selling, you know, this connection that so many people make between deaccessioning and sale, especially the press. So we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Actually, and we've got about 5 more minutes before we want to move on to Q&A. So
okay, all right, fine. So let me move right ahead then. So here's the bottom line for you. Scrupulously follow and document your institution's deaccessioning process every time. Now, this is a piece, the transparency with donors and the public. What are the rights of owners, donors, and lenders in the whole deaccessioning process? Must meet or exceed a very high standard in order to preserve the trust of the public in their work. And it's very easy to lose that trust and very difficult to regain it, I think. We believe that an informed donor is a good donor, or a good donor is an informed donor. And in New York State, in our abandoned property law, actually, museums and heritage organizations are required to offer to a donor or a prospective donor a written copy of the mission statement, the collections policy, and the collections policy that includes policies and procedures of the museum related to what they plan to do with that gift. And that, in fact, at some point in the future, it's not what we're in the business to do. And I'll tell you a brief story about the Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo a few years ago, a major modern and contemporary art museum with a large ancient art collection. The leadership of that institution made the decision to deaccession the ancient art collection and their modern and contemporary art collection. Well, once the public heard about that, I think you could hear Buffalonians screaming at the top of their voices all the way out to Los Angeles. It was a poorly planned and poorly communicated plan, is maybe the better term. And the organization, I think, could have done a lot better at helping Buffalonians understand why it wanted to do this, and kind of quell the concern about Buffalo losing this ancient art collection.
I think that really gets transparent. Sometimes it feels like if we just don't make a big deal about it, no one will notice and it will be fine.
Right.
But you run the risk if you kind of operate that way of really losing the public trust in the long term.
Right.
And so spending a lot of time educating your members, your donors, and the public about what you collect and why, then you can spend some time saying, and we don't collect these sorts of things anymore, or they're not appropriate to our mission. And really think about it as a long-term public relations campaign about what you collect, not about what you don't collect.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So I just wanted to touch upon this notion of use of proceeds and sale of deaccessioned items. As I said earlier, I think a lot of people, the press is a glaring example. of automatically connect the word deaccessioning with sale. We know that the universally accepted practice here is that proceeds from the sale of deaccessioned items must not be used for operating expenses or to pay debt. And in New York State, our regulations say specifically that proceeds can only be used for preservation, protection, and care of the collections. But as I mentioned before, our professional associations have prescribed standards as well, and some of them differ. In some cases nominally, but the differences are important. So here's the AASLH standard for use of proceeds. Collections shall not be deaccessioned or disposed of in order to provide financial support for institutional operations, facilities maintenance, or any reason other than preservation or acquisition of collections. And AAM, a little bit more circumscribed, I think, talks about disposal being only for the advancement of the museum's mission, and proceeds from the sale of non-living collections to be used consistent with the established standards of the museum's discipline, but in no way that it's caused a lot of conversation in the field as to what that really means, and could in fact some operations expenses be included there. And then the most restrictive of all is the Association of Art Museum Directors, which states that their this is what their members subscribe to, that proceeds from a deaccession work are used only to acquire other works of art, and that the proceeds are never used as operating funds to build a general endowment or for any other expenses. And AAMD membership is, I think, capped at 200 of the most influential art museums in the country. And so when an art museum joins AAMD, they subscribe to this. And the National Gallery, the National Academy, which I mentioned earlier, is a member of AAMD. And when they deaccessioned and used their proceeds for capital work and operating expenses, they were essentially shunned by the other members of AAMD for 3 years, I think it is. Deaccessioning goes hand in hand with the museum's collecting goals. It is not the answer to sloppy or non-existent accessioning. It's ultimately a process, a group process, that can incorporate all layers of your institution. And as Stacy mentioned earlier, it requires constant education of board members, of other staff, of volunteers, of your stakeholders. And that education is just it's an ongoing thing, never done. So with that, I'm going to end and share with you.
Actually, I think
I'm not going to do that.
I would say we will do a couple things here. What I'd like to do, because we have just a few minutes left of our webinar today, I do want to remind you that this is the beginning of our conversation. We knew that this was going to be a long conversation. We have been in communication processes and procedures. But just so we have a good sense of where the conversation in the last 3 years, have any of you deaccessioned things from your collection? Where are you on that? And at the same time, since some of you are going to say yes and some of you are going to say no, in the other box there, if you could indicate what the barriers to deaccessioning are for you right now, and we can talk about having a future webinar that would address those barriers. We can also continue this conversation at the Small Museum online community. I'm going to post that link right there in the chat box. If you haven't been there, go there. You can look around that site with you can submit resources, you can comment on the blogs, all those sorts of things, and we will keep this conversation going there. Really encourage you to do that. It looks like we've got a lot of good ideas there. I find it interesting that this is a group. The folks who are in on this webinar right now are groups that have deaccessioned things. So it looks like you have started the process for a lot of you, but may have sort of more follow-up concerns. And so I think that what we can do is focus our future work on kind of perhaps more advanced questions in deaccessioning, problem solving in a more interactive type of way. That's what I'd like to see happen. there are so many fun things there in that chat. I don't know what to say. One thing I did want to bring up was the idea of assessing risk. That you know, if you look at what a deaccessioning process is, it is a good reason to go through a deaccessioning process. It's too much of an investment. You can buy more shelves. You can rent space. So, you know, if the problem is you don't have enough storage, then deaccessioning might not be your answer. So I just want to encourage everyone to think about that. And
well, Stacey, I would just add that it really comes down to the mission of the institution, supporting the mission of the institution. If you have collections that simply don't support that mission, then those collections are, in fact, taking up space and not allowing you to collect and interpret and educate the way you could be if you had collections that were different or better documented or whatever that might be. Now, that's not what the institution's priorities are. But if meeting mission via collections is a very high priority, then I think the institution does have to ask itself those very questions about risk and reward and investment of time.
So, and we do expect to have a blog post up on the Small Museum online community from a group that's used the STEPS curriculum, the STEPS workbook, to have the conversation with their board and to begin the process of deaccessioning. So there'll be a blog post up there in the next couple days that can have that conversation. So I really appreciate all the folks who are writing into that chat box. And if you would like to be involved in a Q&A, where if you've done this a lot, go ahead and identify yourself in that chat box and say, yes, I would love to answer questions about how we did it and what worked well, what didn't work well, because we might just call you and get you to serve on this. And really, we do hope that these events and the Small Museum online community is a place where you feel comfortable having these kinds of conversations and thought. So we will go ahead and leave that last chat box up. And Terry, is there anything else we need to announce at the close of this event? We are recording it. Is that right?
Yes, I think that was what she said.
There, she's unmuted.
I'm unmuted. We are recording this, so it will be available in a couple of days.
Wonderful. And I'm going to go ahead and haul over what you see now there is the slides. You can click on the name of that document, 2012 SMOC Deaccessioning Event Handout. And then down at the bottom, you can click on Save to My Computer, and you can save that so you can look through the slides later on. And we will announce when we have a rescheduled date for Kathleen Byrne from the National Park Service to be with us. And then the last thing I'm going to do is we had a couple of resources. Sorry, I'm going to bring that up again. There you go. That were at the end of our slideshow here, and that's a quick preview of what Kathy will be talking about in the future. Move the presentation away. I promise I will bring it back just so you folks can really see the size. I'm going to make this a little bigger. So those are some of those resources that Anne mentioned. And again, those are in this downloadable event handout here. Yes, Laura was asking. It's right there. And I'm also going to show you the second page of resources, which includes some things on the Small Museum community, so you can get to that from there. Places for the announcement of our next workshop, next online webinar on this topic. And please go to the Small Museums community and join there as a member. And if you choose to set your settings so that you can get email, you'll get a reminder about that rescheduled event. So many thanks to Anne Ackerson for spending a good deal of time, stretching her presentation out a little bit to fill our space and to provide us with some wonderful expertise on really the legal and ethical ramifications of thinking about deaccessioning. So thank you very much, Anne, and maybe we'll get you back here sometime.
You're very welcome.